Works at SUSE and is passionate about all sorts of documentation. And cats, especially the adorable ones. If we're lucky, we might see one of her cats on screen during the talk. Today, she's going to give us the inspiration on how to do a spring clean on our documentation. We are expecting to have some time for questions live on the stream after the talk. So please put your questions into the questions tab that we've now got on the venue list system, and I'll have a chat with Lana after her presentation. But for now, over to you, Lana.
Thank you so much. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Yuggera land on which I'm giving this presentation today, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that this land, which I benefit from occupying, was stolen, and that sovereignty was never ceded by the Yuggera people. So, 2020 was wild. How glad were we all to kick that to the curb? Not only did we reach unprecedented levels of use of the word unprecedented, but last LCA feels like it was sometime in the last century, when all we had to worry about was catastrophic bushfires on just one continent. From what I've seen around me, people have reacted to all this in two main ways. Some have marched forward, reinvented the bits of their lives they needed to, and embraced the change. Think of all those business owners you see on the news who are all like, well, our catering business died overnight, so now we deliver snacks to people by drone. Others have retreated a little, become more introspective, felt a bit sad about the things they've lost, and tried to work out what they want to change in the future. This talk is for that group. If you're looking around at all this and wondering how to make it better, or even if you're just wondering what to do with all that spare time now that your sourdough starter has failed, I'm here to help. I don't know anything about sourdough, but I can help you with that all-important but ever-neglected part of any software project, your documentation. I think most of you already know me, so I won't bore you with my resume, but I do want to talk a little bit about where I'm coming from in this talk. I consider myself an open source technical writer because I have primarily worked on documentation suites that exist in an open source environment. By that, I mean documentation that has its source and usually its toolchain generally available to the public, and that accepts bug reports and pull requests from the community. In most cases, there has been some kind of community around the project I've been documenting, which means that there needs to be a certain level of community engagement involved in both development of the code and development of the documentation. However, in most cases, I've contributed to this documentation within a corporate context. That is, I've been paid by a company to write documentation for a project that is important to them. Of course, there are instances where I have contributed to various documentation projects in my spare time because it's something I'm passionate about, but the majority of documentation I've written has been open source projects working for an enterprise sponsor. This talk is written primarily for people who are working on open source documentation suites, whether or not they're directly employed by corporate enterprise to do so. However, it should hopefully be useful to you if you need to assess documentation in any context, and I've tried to provide perspective on doing this within a corporate environment as well as within an open source community. So, with the boring bit out of the way, let's get into the fun part. Like your lockdown sourdough, it's easy to be enthusiastic about documentation when you get started. You're going to write docs. They're going to be great. You will write all these things down that other writers miss out. And before you know it, you have a very large markdown file with a lot of words in it and a failed sourdough starter that you're probably trying to ignore. I don't know anything about sourdough, as I mentioned, but let's find out if the words are any good. First step is to gather the goods, and I mean all of them. So on this slide, first of all, you'll notice I've got a little blue phone icon up there. That means this might be a good one to take a screenshot of, so keep an eye out for those through the talk. I know that there is a bit of your project that you think of as the docs, but there's probably more that you don't necessarily think of as docs that should be included as well. So start in the repo and think about release notes, code comments, the source code itself, GitHub commit messages, and change logs. Then take a look at the more commercial and marketing stuff you have. Blog posts, white papers, website copy, any articles you've written, any talks you've given, email threads, basically any conversation you've had with people outside your project. And if your project is big enough to have had any kind of sales or support, there'll be a wealth of info in there as well. You've got things like pitches, knowledge bases, forums, and support conversations. Part of this is to think about what you're writing about. Are you writing about something pretty simple that people can use without having any experience? And the example I give here is a toaster. Most people presented with a toaster for the first time would be able to work out how to use it without having anyone show them. You put the bread in the bread-shaped hole at the top, push the lever, wait for it to finish. Because the thing you are writing about in this case is pretty simple and straightforward, you might think that you don't need much documentation. But just because you don't need a lot of docs, you will still need something. And working that out could actually be a bit tricky. You're going to need to think a little bit harder about who you're writing for. Maybe you're writing about something a little bit complicated that people can start to use only after they've done a bit of reading, and they might need to ask some questions as they go along. This type of thing is a little bit more like writing about a car. No one can really get in a car for the first time and drive, but just about everyone can drive once they've had some instruction and a fair bit of practice. So for most people, driving becomes second nature after a while, and you can do it while holding a conversation or singing along to the radio without any trouble. But remember, we all started out with a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, trying to remember to steer, work the pedals, indicate, look at the road signs, and not crash into anyone all at the same time. When you're writing for this product, there's a pretty good chance that you needed to learn how to do this thing yourself, and hopefully it wasn't all that long ago, so you can fairly easily cast your mind back to that. But hopefully there's also someone nearby who has had to learn as well, so go ask them questions. And also, when you have new people coming in, get them to test the documentation to see how it works. But maybe you're writing about something really tricky, something that requires training, a whole lot of background knowledge, a trainer to help them the whole way, and possibly regular refreshers over time. This is more like operating a nuclear reactor. The first thing to work out if you're writing about a nuclear reactor is what reasonable assumptions can you make. There's a fair chance that you can assume at least some kind of prior knowledge, a degree, some relevant experience, or perhaps using some other related tools or software. You need to put those assumptions right up front in your docs so that your readers can go away and learn something else first if they need to. And be prepared to be challenged in these assumptions too. You might discover in time that they're incorrect, and if that happens, you'll need to revisit your documentation as well. So the second step is to forget everything and think about your readers. Just for a moment, I want you to put aside all the things that you've thought about so far and have a look into your project from the outside. Now, this can be a really difficult thing to do, and there's good reason for it. If you've ever been really good at something and tried to show someone else how to do it, you'll probably know that it can be really frustrating because they just don't seem to get it, even though it seems really easy to you. There's actually a good reason for that. Science and research tells us that the more you know about a topic, the less you are able to imagine what it's like to not know it. The technical name for this that I like to use, there's several names, but the one I prefer is called the curse of knowledge, and it does make writing documentation quite difficult. Writers always start by putting themselves in the shoes of the reader, but the curse of knowledge makes it really hard. So it's important to take it seriously and to really try and be honest with yourself about the things you discover. For example, if you're trying to work through a new installation as a reader might, it's easy to think that the next step in a process is intuitive, but you need to ask yourself if it's intuitive because you wrote the software or because you're really familiar with it, or is it really, really intuitive? Add to this the problem that discovering something you wrote or have been involved with, discovering that it's not intuitive or it's not as good as it could be is actually really annoying and upsetting to learn. And so it can be a really difficult process to go through. So have a think. Really need to think really hard about who is reading your documentation. The simple answer to who reads our docs is our users, but that's actually a bit of a cop-out. There's a reason that most technical writers use the term readers rather than users. So we use the term readers for the people who use the product we create. And that's because users use software. and readers read documentation. And that Venn diagram overlaps, but it's not a circle. So your readers are not always, or sometimes not even mainly, your users. Depending on your product, you may find that sales and support staff use your docs more than end users do, which is the case in many professional contexts. In the open source world, you probably find that people read your docs to determine if they want to be involved in your community or if they want to use your product in their own project, or they might want to fork your project for some reason. These readers cannot necessarily be considered users, and it's important that we write documentation that is appropriate for them as well. Now, I'm going to tell you a secret. No one curls up at night with a warm drink and a great technical manual. And if that's the case, why do people read docs? Generally speaking, it's because they want to achieve something. To put that in less abstract terms, you need to work out what problem your reader is trying to solve. So there's a common quote used all the time. It says something like, people don't buy a drill because they need a drill. They buy a drill because they need a hole. When it comes to documentation, though, you need to go a step further and ask why they need the hole. So let's say my friend Alex is at the local hardware store looking at drills. What kind of information would help them? There's a pretty good chance that when Alex woke up this morning, they didn't go, you know what? I don't have a drill. I should go out to Bunnings today and buy one. What's more likely is that they woke up this morning and thought something like, oh, I should hang that picture on my office wall, or I should install that shelving unit. So the content that Alex needs is probably not how to choose a drill. The documentation they need is how to hang a picture or how to put up a shelving unit. This is a really important distinction because if you get it wrong, your readers won't know if the content is right for them, or worse, they won't find your content at all. So one of the non-user reader types that is really common in just about all projects is that of the user-to-be. This is someone who is considering using your product but has not yet started. This person doesn't need to know how to work it, they need to know how it works. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that later on. For now, let's just remember that different readers require different things, often from the same documentation. Now, it's really easy to sit around and have a think about who the readers might be, but it's even better if you can go out and find out for real. So get in contact with your readers any way you can. This is my preferred method. I like to start with a series of one-on-one interviews with people I already know. In an open source community, you can usually reach out to your top contributors and users pretty easily. Also have a board or a core team that you can rely on to get you to the right people. In a corporate environment, I would start with sales, TAMs, and consulting staff. You can then use the information you get from these interviews to create a short survey to send out to wider mailing lists and that kind of thing. So doing it this way serves a few purposes. The first is that you get direct feedback on your current docs. There's a good chance you'll find out some truths about your docs, but it's even more likely that you'll have some suspicions confirmed about the pain points, which is great, because now you have data to back up why you're making changes. You also have a much better story to tell about the improvements. But the second reason is a bit more long-term. You might not get any advantage now, but in the weeks and months to come, when someone notices a problem in the documentation, they're much more likely to think, hold on, there was someone asking about this recently. Who was that? So it builds engagement in the long term as well. It's also really important to understand what your readers actually want rather than what you think they might want. Our developers kept telling us that we needed more quick start information, but when we asked our readers, they all said they wanted more explanations of how things worked, not just step-by-step procedures. Both of those are about getting started, sure, but in terms of the content we needed to write, it was actually very different. By the same token, you also need to find out if readers actually want what they say they want. One piece of feedback we got from a reader was to stop moving things around. This was really interesting to us because when we dug deeper into that problem, it turned out that people found the documentation so difficult to navigate that they were saving hard links to the content they wanted. If we moved things around, those links broke. So the problem was not so much that we were moving things around, but that they couldn't find the stuff they needed in the first place. In the end, the solution we implemented was to improve the navigability of the site. We put in a really good site search mechanism, and we put some more consistency in our section headings and procedure titles, so it was clearer what was in each section. The third step is to work out what's important, and we do this with the very fancy sounding user task analysis. Lots of technical writers do a user task analysis, and it's basically to work out what content needs to be prioritized. You can spend a huge amount of time doing this properly, but you don't really need to. Let me tell you that. It's really just a way to validate what you probably already have in your head by now. So to do this, you need to have an idea of who your readers are, and you also need to know the things your readers want described. The lists don't need to be exhaustive, but you should be able to group most of them into some broad categories that cover the spectrum of readers and tasks. So if you think about the reader types first, the way you categorize your readers is up to you. But sometimes the best way to start is by thinking of a beginner, an intermediate reader, and an expert. Or, depending on the kind of product you have, you might think of an ordinary user, a system admin, and a support person. Your 3 readers should probably be interested in different parts of your product. They will be trying to do different tasks, and they will need different levels of help from your docs. Don't be afraid to let them overlap a little bit, but try and make sure you've covered most of the options. So in this example I'm about to give you, we've got system admin, sales, and support, but you could easily include developers, hobbyists, executives, or any number of others. So then you need to have a think about what your readers are trying to achieve. For each of your readers, start by thinking about how they might begin. What's the very first thing they might want to do? And then assume that they've managed to complete that without any trouble. What's the second thing they'd want to do? And now they've managed to complete that, what's the third thing? Again, you don't need to be exhaustive, but make sure you cover the big ticket items, things like installing, configuring, troubleshooting, that kind of thing. So once you have those things, you can put them in a little table like this and work out how likely it is that a particular reader will use the documentation to do each task. If you put the reader types across the top of your table and all of the tasks down the side, you get a great matrix that looks something like this one. Obviously, this is only the first few lines. You'd probably have a lot more tasks, but it should be enough to give you the idea. You can fill out each square on the table with the likelihood that each reader type will use the docs to do each task. Now, note the really important thing here. You're not asking if system admins are likely to do a product installation, because of course they are. You're asking if system admins are likely to use the documentation to do a product installation. That answer is a little bit trickier, and it depends on things like how easy your product is to install, how often a system admin is to do that task, that kind of thing. So when you have all the boxes filled out, you can do some simple maths. Score a 3 for high likelihood, 2 for medium, and 1 for low. And that gives each task a critical path score. The higher the number, the more critical the documentation for this task is. So in the example here, you can see that product research scores a 6 because it's really only important to one group, but managing clients scores a 9 because it's important to everyone. That means we know to spend more time and effort on documenting how to manage clients, and we can improve the general product info later on. So 4th step is to find the gaps. You've got to match what you have to what you need, find out where the gaps are. Tech writers refer to the highest scoring things in that table as critical paths. The items with the highest critical path score is the content that is most important for you to write. All this, of course, doesn't mean that the lower ranked things aren't important, of course, but it's just about a way to find your focus. If you find that your focus points are not adequately covered in your existing docs, then you have an immediate start point. But before you start writing, you need to have a think about what content type each of these things requires. So earlier we talked about different readers needing different content. I said something like, this person doesn't need to know how to work it, they need to know how it works. To demonstrate what I mean by that, I want you to consider a giant red button that has the word stop on it. If you want to understand how to work this, you would need content that says something like, press the stop button to shut down the process. If you want to understand how it works, you need something more like, When the stop button is pressed, a signal is sent to the machine to immediately stop all running processes. The processes will stop completely within 5 seconds. So in the first example, the explanation is suitable for someone who wants to stop the machine and needs to know how, and it answers the question, how do I do it? In the second example, it's suitable for someone who needs to understand how the machine works. It answers the question, what is it? To make this a little bit easier, and a bit easier to get your head around, we can categorize all content into one of 3 content types. Everyone has their own way of thinking about these, so I'm going to give you a couple of different definitions for each one, and hopefully at least one of them really sticks for you. So the first one is a concept. Concepts describe how and why something works. Concepts answer the question, what is it? When readers read concepts, they're engaging in a learning behavior, and they're reading about a topic to understand more about it. Concepts are designed for people who are unfamiliar with a topic to get enough understanding about what the thing is so that they can start being productive with it. In other words, they're going from not understanding to understanding. Some tech writers also like to consider what shape a content type has on the page. So if you try to imagine what a concept would look like if you were too far away to read the actual words, it would look something like this picture. That is generally paragraphs of ordinary prose sentences. So every single time you write something, you should start with a concept. If the concept is simple, it could be one sentence, but a more complicated concept could go for many pages. You need to write as much as you need to get the concept across. The second is tasks. Tasks give specific instructions about how to get something done. Tasks answer the question, how do I do it? When readers read tasks, they're engaging in a doing behavior. So think about your readers as having your task open to one side, and they're doing the thing in front of them. So they can read a step and perform the action immediately before going on to read the next step. Tasks tend to have a specific goal, and they consist of a set of numbered steps that the reader can follow to achieve that goal. The shape of a task on the page looks like this picture. It's not in the picture, but it does usually have a title, and they're followed by numbered steps. We should be all fairly familiar with tasks. The third and final content type is reference, and it is a little bit of a catch-all. References contain structured information or specifications that users need to make a product work. Reference material answers the question, what else do I need to know? When readers read reference material, they're engaging in a fact-checking behavior, and it's usually some form of looking up information. They're sometimes trying to determine the definition or explanation for something, or it's to refresh their memory in the case of, say, switches for commands. Reference sections comprehensively catalog data like functions and their parameters, return codes, and error messages. The generally accepted shape of a reference looks like a table. Tables are the most common shape for references. They can also be things like bulleted lists, definition lists, or sample scripts, depending on what you're writing about. So now that we understand the content types, you should be able to arrange your docs so that you have concepts at the top, followed by the related tasks. Then at the end of each section, you can include the reference information. It's also really important to note here that the 3 content types shouldn't be intertwined. They should all sit separately from each other. And I will go so far as to say there are no exceptions to this rule. Don't ever put concept information into a task or put a task into your reference. It's really easy to do. It's probably easier to do this than you think. When you're writing a task, you all of a sudden realize you need to describe what something is, and you whack a concept in there. And that's really important that you don't do that. If you find yourself doing it, you actually need to go back and reorganize your content so that it's a little bit more modular. So now you should have a list of critical paths. You should have some idea of what content type each critical path requires. You can use this as your to-do list. The next step is to make the dream match reality. And I'll go so far as to say it's probably the hardest one. You'll need to be realistic about what you can achieve and face the facts that you might not have the resources or the will to get things perfect. If you're upfront about this with yourself, it will help you to avoid being terribly disappointed later on. It also works well for your New Year's resolutions. So say you wanted to get fit in 2021 and work off all that sourdough you ate during lockdown. You wouldn't just start weighing yourself weekly and hoping. You would start by planning a diet, working out what exercise you can do, and your fitness goals, that kind of thing. You also need to do the same thing for your documentation. Is it going to be comprehensive and detailed, or simple and sparse? Is it going to use simple language designed for people who've never done this before, or more technical language for people who know what they're doing and just need the basics? Is it going to start from the very beginning, or are you going to assume that your readers already have some knowledge? And remember that if you have made any assumptions, you need to state them up front and always make sure you're prepared to go back and readjust them if needed to. So by now, you should hopefully have a good idea of what your ideal documentation looks like. It will be, of course, a shining beacon of docs goodness, hitting all the critical paths for all your readers, and people will talk about it for years to come. But it's a grim reality that project documentation needs to be maintained. Have a think about how many writers your project might be able to access. Are you likely to have writers on the project over time? What skill level are they likely to have? Is there any content that already exists elsewhere that you can point to rather than writing it yourself? Is there any way you can automate any part of the documentation, such as using code comments to generate API docs? And once you've considered those things, that's when you really start to get making decisions. You've thought about your readers, you've thought about the kinds of things they might want to do, you've thought about the kind of content you already have and what's missing. Then you faced reality and realized that you might not be able to create perfect docs, but you can certainly improve what you already have. So now that the dream matches reality, you can make reality match the dream. Don't let your docs project be like your New Year's resolutions, forgotten and lonely by the end of the year. The best way to make sure that you stick to your docs goals is to work out how much you can do and set a deadline for each step in the process. Once you have an idea of what you need to write, you can split up docs work like this. 20% for planning, 50% for drafting, use 20% of the time for reviewing and editing, and 10% of the time for production or publication. And of course, don't forget to do a retrospective, but that happens after the deadline. So let's say you want to use a how-to, you have 5 months to do it. So let's try and work out what you'd need to do. I've chosen 5 months only because it works out to be a neat 100 days, working days. That's if we're not counting weekends and you're allowing for a few holidays. You can, of course, adjust this however you like. Say, for example, if you're only working weekends or if you have other projects or if you have a shorter or longer time. But for a 5 month project, working 5 days a week with a couple of holidays, you would use 4 weeks for planning, 10 weeks for drafting, 4 weeks for reviewing and editing, 2 weeks for production, and then do a short retrospective afterwards. And you can see one of my many other talks for how to do a retrospective. The most important thing about planning documentation work is that you need to be flexible. Things don't always work out, and that's okay. Perhaps you get a new job and you end up with no time to work on things. If you've written down your plan, you've spoken to others in your project about what you were going to do, then others can pick up the work. And when you're able to, you can come back to it. Perhaps you get an injection of cash and you can hire some writers. Go back to the critical paths, expand your scope, and hand that planning to them so that they have somewhere to start and they understand your vision for the docs. Or maybe things just don't work out and the project ends up being abandoned entirely. That's sad, but it's okay. At least you've finished up with some valuable knowledge, so you'll be even better for your next project. Now, there's just one thing left to do. Your dream matches reality. You're making reality match the dream. Go ahead and start writing. Incidentally, if you are interested in revisiting some of the content that I've gone through in this presentation, including the amazing cartoons that my niece drew for me, then go and check out the interactive information architecture guide that I wrote for the Good Docs project. And you can find that at the address on your screen, which is the gooddocsproject.dev/ia-guide. Of course, there's also lots of other great advice and documentation templates in the Good Docs project for you as well. And that is it. Thank you for listening, everybody.
Thank you, Lana. That was a great talk. You had me caught from the start. Like within seconds, I was laughing at what you were saying, which I'm sure was your intention.
And hopefully the cartoons as well.
Yeah, they are great. You should definitely. Was it your niece? You said
my niece. Yes, she's
your niece.
10.
Wow, that is great. That is great. We do have some questions with the new question feature that's come up just today. I don't have who the person asked the question, so I'm sorry about this. The first question is, can you point to existing docs that do a good job with the concept task reference model?
I don't have any off the top of my head, but most of the bigger projects that have had actual technical writers working on them, it tends to be something that technical writers do, either because they've approached it that way deliberately, because concept task reference is a very standard way of doing technical writing, or because they're using software that actually makes it happen that way. Anything that uses DITA, D-I-T-A, actually organizes the content that way for you. But I'm trying to come up with some good examples. Most, I'll say the OpenStack docs because I worked on them. I know they're all pretty good. DigitalOcean is generally pretty good. There's lots and lots of good examples, and you sort of, all the ones that have been developed by more or less professional groups are pretty good.
With that concept task, if you've got the concepts first and then the references, is there a risk that your readers who prefer to read top to bottom for whatever reason become, I don't know, bored or disengaged while they're going through a document that has a longer concepts section?
Hopefully not. I think the trick there is to make sure you're actually only describing the concepts that are important at that time.
Yeah.
I do tend to err on the side of shorter concepts, but sometimes you write a whole book that's just concepts as well. Sometimes it depends on what you're trying to achieve and what your readers are trying to achieve. If your reader's main goal is to understand something, then it's going to be concepts all the way. Yeah. If your reader's goal is to do something, then you need short concepts followed by tasks. Short concept followed by task. Yep.
So when trying to work out what your readers want to do or what the problems are that kind of they're facing, these future people that your documentation is going to speak to, do you have any tools to help kind of brainstorm that?
I think everyone has their own, to be honest.
Fair enough.
Personally, I am a little bit old-fashioned, I guess. I do start with the one-on-one interviews. The most recent project I did was a really big one for SUSE a couple of years ago. And I did just go out to our consultants and our sales staff and say, hey, have you got 10, 15 minutes to chat about docs? And I had a list of questions and I asked every single one of them the same questions. Wrote down their answers, and then use that to develop a survey. And I now run that same survey with the same questions about twice a year, just to be able to get the feedback overall. I just send it out to all our mailing lists and announce it in community groups. And we get answers to the same questions twice a year, and I can graph how we're actually doing over time. So it gives you that feedback mechanism. And I just use SurveyMonkey. Cool. There's no special tools going on in there.
Yeah. Hey, when you were talking about interviewing people, I think I may have not heard something correctly. So you said specifically about in the corporate environment, I think you said you would start with sales, TAMs, and consulting staff.
Yep.
Who is TAMs?
Oh, a technical account manager.
Right.
They're the people who look after the big customers generally. So if you've got larger special customers, then they usually have a TAM associated with them. TAM may be a little bit specific to some companies that I've worked in, but that's fine. I'm talking about the people who manage the big accounts.
Great. We've got a question that's come through. This one comes from Nicola and I. Contributors often like adding in an FAQ because adhering to the structure of the existing docs can feel overwhelming. What's a good way to stop that happening?
FAQs are messy. They're hard to maintain. And I know people who aren't technical writers seem to like them. I'm not certain if there's a way to stop it happening. I am a big fan of if FAQs have happened, and sometimes they do happen organically through the general process of talking to customers and that kind of thing. If FAQs have happened, I like to go through and review them and bring them into the documentation proper, because otherwise, so with FAQs, you've got a couple of problems. One is when you're reading the documentation, you're looking at your concepts, you're doing your tasks, sometimes you're not seeing those FAQs. The FAQs have to be read in conjunction with other docs. So you're going to be having information that your readers are missing. So that's one problem. So it's important to get that content, bring it back into the actual documentation proper. The other problem is FAQs tend to get written in relation to really specific problems. And sometimes the answer to that is to change the software, not necessarily to update the documentation. And you need to be able to manage that. So I would, if FAQs have happened, I would A, try to shut them down, and B, make sure that you're reviewing them constantly to work out, is this a bug in the product, or do we need to actually write this in the documentation proper? So I'm not sure you can stop them, unfortunately.
It sounds like Nicola is definitely on your side with...
I know Nicola and I go way back, yes. Right. She probably knows more about this stuff than I do.
Okay. I've got another question. In user task analysis, how fine-grained do you try and make those tasks? Because it seems like you could like pick any level of granularity and waste heaps of time if you go to...
You absolutely could, and some tech writers do. It's easy to go too deep, but the pressures of trying to get documentation out the door usually means you don't have a huge amount of time to spend on it. So when I talk about using 20% on planning, I would spend a reasonable chunk of that planning time doing a user task analysis. But by the time you get to actually doing it, if you've been doing your research, you've done your surveys, you've had your interviews, all that kind of thing, you actually have a pretty good idea of what your user task analysis is going to tell you. And so you can pretty easily pop it into a matrix, do the maths, and then go, okay, yes, my suspicions have been confirmed.
Hello, I think talk, and it was a fantastic way to end the day.